Hey everybody, I wanted to make a quick tutorial about something that I've been working on recently. I know it's been a while, so I just wanted to kind of make a mini tutorial right now, kind of exploring the workflow I did on my most recent model. I thought you guys might find it kind of interesting, so I thought I'd share it with you guys. So this is just going to be a mini tutorial. A lot of the techniques I use in this tutorial I've discussed elsewhere, and I will link in the description and in the video when I see that I did something I've already explained, so just keep an eye out for that. Right now, I just wanted to kind of show you the UV unwrapping I did for this model. It's very simple. I think this model was entirely mirrored. That I think makes a lot of the UV unwrapping a little bit easier. If your model is going to be texturally the same on both sides, I don't see an issue with doing mirroring. It also makes the UV unwrapping just way simpler. And so with shapes like this, I tend to focus on sectioning off cylinders. So in this case, the arms, the legs, the tail, and the ears, because the way I kind of conceptualize UV unwrapping on a very basic level is how can I basically detach the cylinders, and then I usually end up adding a seam along the inside. So you can kind of imagine like a soda can, if you cut a line down it and spread it flat, how that would unwrap, and that's kind of how I imagine. Like the arms, I add a seam down, the thighs, I added a seam down the inside so you can't see them. Tail, I added a seam, and the ears so that they unwrapped flat. And the eyes are just a half sphere, so they unwrapped flat as well. And that's just the very basics of this. I might go into more depth about this because I don't have a dedicated UV unwrapping tutorial, but that's just the basics of that particular process. And then from that point, I wanted to texture it, and I've experimented with a lot of different texturing softwares, and I find that I really enjoy 3D Coat because it's very simple. Initially, I was using Blender, mostly because I wasn't really sure what else to use. I really like using the round brush and just most basic kind of painting possible. But Blender doesn't really have a good layer system. And also, I couldn't really figure out how to erase. It's probably just me, but I was getting really frustrated with it. I felt like I was redoing a lot of my work. So I transitioned to 3D Coat, and I found that that's actually super easy for me to use. Basically, you just pop it in, and you can kind of just treat it like Photoshop, where you add a layer, and you can pretty much just start painting on it immediately. I haven't really used 3D Coat for much other than painting, but I might explore that more in the future. But yeah, anyway, let me kind of describe my thought process here with the painting. So this is just kind of a quick preview. This particular character didn't require a whole lot of texture. It was a lot of just like soft gradients, really focusing on the muzzle and the paws to just kind of build up those textures. This is also, I think, a really good beginner kind of model because painting hand-painted textures can be kind of complicated, especially because a lot of hand painting has to do with diffuse lighting and baking lighting and making that look authentic. So something that has just color variation and a little bit of shadow, say under the belly, is a pretty good start. It's just something really simple. I really like just blocking in big dark shapes, especially for this model. It was all about just that really soft texture and all about like just adding that color. And so the main thing I'm thinking about when I'm creating models like this is creating form and definition through shadow shapes, through adding dark and light. Like with the eyes here, I added kind of the idea that there is, a shadow coming from the brow, and the bottom of the eye is lighter, so you can kind of see that depth, that like spherical shape kind of comes through a little better, because when it's just a flat texture it tends to look confusing. And then I think hand painting can be done well if it's subtle, and it just adds like a little bit extra, a little bit more definition than just the flat cell shading. It's like the next step, I think. Here I'm just doing that thing I've talked about with baked shadows. I'm basically pretending that there is a light coming from the top, maybe the sun, and adding that little bit of definition down there really makes it feel dimensional. And I think a lot of hand painting has to do with that, is just adding that dimensionality with a tiny bit of really soft, diffuse ambient lighting from maybe above most of the time. Here I'm just painting in some toe beans. I usually don't add really small details like this to low poly models, mostly because from a distance it might end up blending together, but I felt like this detail was important. Here I'm just exporting the texture as a PNG just to bring it right back into Blender. And from here, I am just adding a toon shader in in Cycles. Eevee doesn't support the toon shader. And here I'm just kind of adding a sunlight and adjusting it to where I think it would look good just initially. kind of playing with some lighting and seeing how that will end up if I textured it in a way I liked that worked well with the shader. I think one of the strengths about texture shading like this, if you keep it simple, you can't go wrong. It tends to look really great with the cell shader, as long as there's not like a lot of smaller details. I mean, it also can work too, but just keeping it really soft, really general, the focus on defining those core forms, it tends to look awesome with the cell shader. And here I'm just kind of touching up the texture in Blender, because I find in 3D Code it always doesn't get exactly what I want, because I kind of need to see it where it will be rendered for it to be perfect. So I'm just adding some extra details in Blender's texture painter. I don't really enjoy doing it in Blender's texture painter, but you just go to texture paint and make sure you have the right image loaded in. You can go to the image editor, which used to be associated with the UV editor, but now it's like its own thing. You can also just paint there on top of the UV, which makes this process really simple. And then I just loaded that in to see how that was interacting with the sun lamp that I had put there before. The next thing I'm doing is I'm just going to add a sunlight, and I tend to use that with all of my cell shading. I like how you can adjust the angle of it. It's right, if you change it to 1, it makes a really sharp, almost like Wind Waker style cell shade, and if you increase it, it kind of makes it a little bit softer, makes it look a little bit maybe like rounder, so you can kind of choose what you want. And here I'm just kind of like messing with it to try and get the best form definition that doesn't look confusing. I tend to think like just top down, kind of 3/4 tends to work well. I also added a rim light and made it just extremely strong with like an angle of 1, so it was very sharp, and that helps to just kind of define the shape of the character. I have a tutorial about lighting that I can also link in the description. And here I'm just starting the quadruped rig. I don't have a lot of experience with quadruped rigs, so I was kind of using what I knew from human rigs and kind of experimenting a little bit, but I found that this rig worked pretty well. I kind of have an understanding of basic animal anatomy and how that would correspond to the skeleton itself. So whenever you're making a rig for an animal you don't quite understand, the best thing to do would be looking at the actual skeletal structure in the main bones, because rigs are just generally copies of bone structures that exist. Here I'm just making sure that all the bones are placed as correctly as possible. I'm going to be mirroring these bones over, so I want to make sure I've got them correct the very first time I did it. Here I just selected the bones I wanted to be mirrored over, and you can just press spacebar and look up symmetrize, and that should flip it right over and mirror it. And here I just brought it into pose mode so I could quickly test how it was rotating before I actually weighted it. And there I just auto weighted it. I have a whole tutorial series about how to weight things, so I will link that in the description. Here I was just trying to figure out how many bones the tail should have, and I realized I needed more loops to create a cleaner bend, especially in the tail. I didn't realize how many bones and loops I would need, but it turned out a lot, because that's a structure that moves quite a lot. And here I'm just adding kind of a mouth bag. I'm keeping it flat because the mouth is just going to be opening and it's low poly. Usually you'd have it be round so that there was like depth in the mouth, but for me, just keeping it flat for this instance worked pretty well. And then just so you can't see inside of the head. Here I'm creating kind of an upper lid and a lower lid bone, just so the cat can blink and have like some kind of basic facial expression. Obviously cats don't have a lot of movement in their face, so the rig for the head would not be all of that complex. Here I'm just making sure that the eye bones and the mouth are all parented to the head bone, and the ear bones as well, and just kind of rotating it to make sure everything is moving along right before I do, again, any weighting, making sure that around where the knee technically would be has enough loop geometry for it to bend smoothly. And here I realized that I was actually missing a bone, kind of like the wrist bone of the cat, so I subdivided that with W, and kind of shifted that to where I thought it made sense. And as you can see, this like makes a lot more sense, so I would call the rig complete at this point. So if you wanted to use this rig, I would say use it like this. And then with auto weight painting, it should do probably 90% of the work for you. One of the things I'm always looking for is to make sure that the bones, specifically the joint area, aligns with the edge loops in the middle. That way you get the cleanest deformations, and I'm just kind of adjusting it here to make sure that wherever it bends, there are loops for that. So in this part, I just subdivided the ear bone, pressing W and subdivide. Cats have a lot of muscles in their ears to rotate, and I wanted to reflect that when the animal would be moving. So I just auto-weighted those and kind of erased some of the influence I didn't want around them so that the deformation would be accurate. And here I'm just trying to adjust the jawbone. I auto-weighted it, and so when you auto-weight it, it kind of drags down the whole face instead of just the jaw itself. So I'm just in edit mode selecting the polys that I don't want to be affected at all, and then going into that vertex group and removing that influence entirely. This is, in my opinion, the easiest way to isolate just the bottom jaw area and make sure the bone only affects that area. And here I am just kind of testing it to make sure it's deforming the way I want. I noticed that I wanted to add some fangs, so I just kind of put them in there. And at this point I realized that the face isn't deforming the way that I want it to. It's very sharp at the edges. It creates this kind of like square shape I'm not really loving. So I actually added in another edge loop to give that more of a rounded shape. And then I had to adjust the weight painting for that so that it stretched without dragging the entire loop down. So it was like half the loop. So it created the round shape when the mouth opened instead of that like weird rectangular shape that we were getting. And here I'm just messing with the lower and upper lid that had been auto-weighted. This is kind of the result I got just straight out of Blender. And so essentially what I wanted to do is make sure I was getting a little bit less influence. It was just dragging too much and not enough on the eyelid itself. I always want to be able to like make the cat blink with the top lid, especially if I'm doing a very simple thing like this. So when the upper lid goes all the way down, it closes satisfactorily, and then with the lower lid it actually has a little bit of influence on the cheek itself, so that when that lower lid lifts it kind of does almost a snarl, which I found out that I really liked. So I was just kind of making sure the influence wasn't too strong on the opposite side by accident. And then here I'm just adding an eye track. I have a tutorial about this. It's a very simple way of creating movement with the eyes. Basically you take the sphere of the eye and add an object constraint that tracks the eye to that bone, and so the eyes will then follow that bone around. And you can see me here just adding the track to each of the eye objects, and I'll link this in the description as well. But this is kind of my go-to method when I just want something really simple and I just want some like very simple movement with those eyes. Here I'm just making sure the origin is in the right place for the track to. And as you can see, the eyes follow the bone. You have to make sure the origin's in the right spot or they kind of like go outside of the head. And I'm just double checking all of my eye track, my jaw, to make sure that they are functioning correctly, making sure that the ear bone. I always recommend doing a bunch of tests and a bunch of different poses when you're done with a model like this, because you inevitably will find little issues with the weight painting. Later on I even refined it a little bit more, but this is like mostly what I did, and I think that if you use this process you should be able to get a really like similar result. You should be quite happy with it. I think this is the simplest way I found to rig quadruped. And then here I'm just doing some basic rendering. I have my light set up. I made sure that the angle of the light was the way I wanted it. I'm just doing a very basic pose. I'm actually working on a different a different window while the rendering in cycles is happening, so I can really see how it looks updated. And so I just added a subdivision surface to give it a little bit of smoothness. I wouldn't do that when I gave it to the client, but just for this render I wanted it to look nice and smooth. And that's kind of the basics of it. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions, please let me know. And I hope you guys make some really awesome quadrupeds. Thanks for watching. Also, if this cat model is something you guys would be interested in purchasing, I could make variant cats, different types, dogs, etc. Just let me know in the comments if that's something you guys would be interested in, and I'll see if I can see about getting that done.